joining me. So as Robin said, I'm Jade Clayton, Manager of Project Development at MTA. I am also here with my colleague, AJ Bhadai. He is a transit equity planner in the Project Development Division as well. So we'll be splitting this presentation. All right. Does everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so let's get started. Thank you again, Robin and Jimmy at Transit Choices for hosting us. As the synopsis says, the public draft of the statewide transit plan was published earlier in January, the first week of January. The comment period continues until February 18th. So we are here to highlight some of the key sections of the plan, hoping you will review them later if you haven't already and provide comments and questions to the team. We like to keep our presentation brief, so there's time for questions, less talking and more listening to all of you. So let's get started. The agenda essentially is a condensed version of the chapter of contents in the draft plan, the purpose, vision, and goals, the proposed transit connections, strategies for achieving our vision, and metrics and short-term action plan to both show and measure early progress toward that vision. So don't have to wait 50 years for something to happen. There are 5-year steps. And then we'll wrap up with all of the ways to engage in the public comment period while it's still open. So the purpose of a 50-year plan, as a refresher, is to define the desired performance and customer experience outcomes that will drive how we provide transit for people today and for future generations. We stitched together local and regional plans across the state and created a community-driven, data-driven, and policy-driven framework for continued maintenance and enhancement of transit service. We started this effort in 2020 with a number of visioning sessions with MDOT, other state agencies like the Department of Planning, Department of Disabilities, regional and metropolitan planning organizations, over 20 local transit providers. We also surveyed the public about potential vision, goals, and strategies early on. We continued offering and accepting invitations to brief people and organizations about the plan throughout the entire development process. We also paused at key steps to host roundtables with our state, regional, and local partners. You can kind of see those on the timeline, but those were essentially at the beginning, during visioning, in the middle when we were looking at existing conditions and needs, and then again, most recently when the draft plan came out to talk about the actual strategies and the metrics that came out of those early discussions. So we continued. In total, we had 3 roundtables, as I said, and we also just touch on that broader effort during AJ's part of the presentation. So after the comment period closes, we will be heads down, combing through the comments received and revising and finalizing the plan to be published later this year. So similar to how we've had an implementation team and program for the Central Maryland Regional Transit Plan, which this group is definitely familiar with, the RTP, we will be strategizing about how to keep momentum and implement that statewide plan. That conversation started with the statewide roundtable and will continue through finalization of the plan. So I always like to share this helpful context. If you haven't seen our presentation before, the timeline shows how much changed in the past 50 years. To put this into perspective, just how much can change in that time frame. So 50 years ago, just starting Amtrak, December, the state had just taken over the provision of bus service in Baltimore. And then in 2020, we were in the midst of a global pandemic that completely upended travel in the transit industry. It might seem like a difficult time to plan, but also a necessary time to plan for the future. So it is a time when we are aware of the possibility of major change in our industry and of transit's role in essential services accessible, and also hopefully returning to making life and economic opportunity accessible as well. Another nice visual to put things into perspective. This is produced by the Maryland Department of Planning. They're actually updating it for 2020, but it gives nearly a 50-year time frame of how much land use and land cover has changed in the state. And that really changes how much we need to connect to with transit and with other modes of transportation. Excuse me. And so, we have to ask ourselves, and we did do some projections of how much housing is going to change, how much employment is going to change, and where that'll be located to think about what the future connections need to be. Okay. And this is the final set of vision and the 7 goals that we came up with all of that input early on. So the vision, as it reads, is the Maryland's public transit system will connect people, places, and opportunities, supporting Maryland's economy with efficient, equitable, sustainable, and innovative transit. And transit riders across the state will experience convenient and coordinated travel and a dignified customer experience. And the 7 goals, I won't read each of those, but they are in the plan, and we'll kind of go through a few of them and highlight strategies with AJ. For that, I think what everyone loves is a good map. So this is our existing inner city and regional connections. It's important to note that it doesn't show all the local transit connections. That would start to look a little bit like abstract art on the map, but we're not getting rid of those. They'll still be there. They're an important part of this to provide that local connection to more regional and inner city service. What the map does show is our commuter bus service, the regional and local rail, inner city rail, and inner city bus and commuter bus services as well. And then this is the 50-year vision for connections. It includes a lot of connections you'll already be familiar with from existing plans, local and regional plans, including our own at MTA, and a few that don't show up in plans as much and it may be more in conversation. So it kind of might be the first time for some of these putting them in a plan and saying in an action plan that we will start to study and advance those connections. Just to provide a little bit of definition, the regionally significant transit connections are the corridors where local, regional, and more commute-oriented transit service could be supported, a little bit higher frequency of service, every 30 minutes or better, more stops and stations, more connections to destinations of local and regional significance. And then the inner city transit connections are more longer distance transit service that could be supported, maybe lower frequency, but still regular service, faster travel times, and again, longer distances between stops and stations. So that's kind of the division that we had of the 2 types of statewide connections that we're focused on. So this is just a moment to reflect on the list of projects, as we will want to talk about this. I think this will be a big part of the Q&A in terms of what people are excited about seeing on this list and anything you think might be missing. All right, that'll hand it off to AJ to cover some other sections of the plan.
Awesome, thanks, Jade. Building off the 7 goals and the projects and corridors that Jade just identified, we developed an actionable set of strategies, which makes up a good portion of the content of the draft plan. So in total, there are 31 strategies identified. These are based on, particular priorities and opportunities, best practices, input from MDOT/MTA, as well as feedback from stakeholders and the public. And so some of the themes that you'll find throughout the strategies include integrated fare payment, new technology, safety practices, customer-friendly features, and enhanced and expanded service to essential destinations. The next couple slides, I'm going to go through some specific strategies just to provide some examples. So we're looking at an example right now. Before I jump into the details, I did want to take a note that throughout the draft plan, and you can see on these slides, there are sections called What Success Looks Like. These are essentially, real life scenarios that are related to a particular strategy or goal. And so our approach in developing these strategies, we're trying to figure out how we can put it in the perspective and frame it from the customer or rider impact. And so that is, you'll see that consistently throughout the plan. So to start, this strategy of reducing cost as a barrier falls under the goal of be equitable, accessible, and affordable. Part of the strategy includes things like adopting open fare payments, bringing your own device technology, and as well as making fare capping and regional or statewide discount and incentive programs more feasible for transit agencies across the state. And so for what success looks like, this scenario is of a warehouse employee being able to travel to late night or weekend shifts using affordable transit. I think here there's definitely, this is definitely something we heard a lot throughout the public survey. And we definitely want to make the connection and emphasize that equitable and accessible part of planning accessibly and equitably is ensuring late night and weekend shift riders have access to affordable transit. Next slide, please. Thanks. So under the goal of ensuring a safe and healthy transit environment is the strategy of providing safe and access to transit for all road users. And so this basically encourages transit agencies to work closely with local planning and public works departments to not only plan, design, but also build safer and more accessible paths to transit. That looks like filling in gaps in existing pedestrian and bike network, which will result in a safer street crossing. Okay, next slide, please. And then another example for today, under connecting people to jobs and opportunities, is ensuring transit service serves essential destinations. And those destinations include medical facilities, civic centers, schools, grocery stores. And this strategy works to encourage Maryland transit agencies provide and prioritize investments that would benefit transit service to essential destinations. So this can look many ways. This could be identifying where and when transportation is needed to regionally significant destinations and just prioritizing that investment that's essential. And you can see what success looks like. This is a single parent who can live in an affordable community and access jobs throughout Maryland using transit. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So we've identified these strategies and opportunities to have specific actionable steps, as well as associated timeframes in which we can complete the work. So Jade was mentioning this at the beginning. A part of the actual draft plan includes a 5-year action plan, which you're seeing a kind of snippet from that on the right side of the screen. So what we're going to do next is just take a look at some of the strategies that have made it in this 5-year action plan that are all organized by goal. Next slide, please. So this slide shows, this is a list of some strategies that help make up the 5-year action plan. So to start, under the goal of be equitable, accessible, and affordable, we will conduct ADA inventory on all equipment, stops, and facilities and establish priorities for ADA upgrades. You can see next, under the goal of ensuring a safe and healthy transit environment, we'll partner with jurisdictions as we identify gaps in pedestrian and bike connections. That's related to the strategy I mentioned earlier. The next, to provide mobility between the regions, we will study the barriers to paratransit service integration, and so on and so forth. I don't know if I need to go through all of these, but essentially the 5-year action plan is a way to kind of break down what is a very large visionary 50-year plan into priorities and set up timelines in which MDOT-MTA and partners across the state can sort of start to advance and accomplish some of these opportunities. Okay, next slide, please. Great. So in addition to the action plan, we also identified some metrics to measure the success of implementing the STP strategies. These metrics are aligned with achieving the goals of the plan and are focused on how riders can experience our service. So for instance, ADA accessibility of stop stations and vehicles and having shared fare payment options are key interactions that our riders have when taking transit across the state, and improving these measures will, impact the overall rider experience. And you can see here, a part of these metrics and a part of the implementation of the statewide transit plan is working with lots to expand, reporting of these measures to allow us to reflect the improvements our state is making in transit over the next 5-year, 25-year, and 50-year targets, which you can see on the table on the right side. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so this is sort of an overview of the outreach and engagement that we've conducted throughout the development of the plan. Jade was mentioning some of this at the beginning. So throughout, we've been coordinating with the locally operated transit system staff, lots, planning departments, economic development offices, Department of Public Works, staff from across the state. We just finished, you can see January 2022, our latest roundtable, which was essentially an opportunity for us to present the draft plan to our statewide partners, hear their initial feedback, encourage them to participate in the public comment period, as well as to start the discussion of how to engage moving forward and how we want to work together to implement the plan. Next slide, please. So yeah, to conclude, the draft plan is still available for public comment. It closes February 18th. You can provide comment directly on the plan itself. You can, complete an online comment card. You can provide comments through phone or email. There's many different venues. We're trying to make it as accessible and easy for folks to provide that feedback. And all of this information is available on the webpage, and you can find links to the platform to provide direct comments, and feel free to share that out. So after we complete the public comment period, we will work to, revise the plan, consolidate those comments, and do another round to integrate those comments into the draft plan. And then we will finalize and begin to start implementing. So I think that might be the last slide, Jade. That could be just, of course, there's a thank you slide. Yeah, so thank you so much for, again, your time and your interest in the statewide transit plan. I hope that you all, if you haven't already, find some time to provide comments, and I'm sure Jade and I would love to take some questions or initial feedback now, if we have time.
Thank you, AJ. Would you be able to minimize the presentation, please?
Yeah, Jade, I think, yeah, that's you, Jade.
I said pause share. Maybe I just have to stop sharing altogether.
Yeah, Robin, you want us to just be able to see each other?
That's perfect. Yes. So I would first like to thank Jade and AJ for their very interesting and informative presentation. This is very important work that they're doing, and it's also essential, I believe, that they receive public input. To that end, I will be sure, when I send both the PowerPoint presentation as well as the meeting recording, a reminder and a link that comments and input are still welcome and will be received up to and including February 18th. I'd like to kick off the question part of our meeting by asking about the regional transit plan. This can go to either Jade or AJ in terms of the specific difference between the statewide plan and, as always, how transit choices can be helpful in moving that agenda forward.
Yeah, Jade, I can take that if that's okay. So the regional transit plan specifically was legislatively mandated, and that was published in 2020. And so that includes the Central Maryland jurisdiction. So that's Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Howard County, Harford County, and Anne Arundel County. And so that is specifically within the confines of Central Maryland and has a 25-year scope. And so when we completed that plan, I think there was an opportunity to build on that capacity and to expand that to the whole state, as well as to expand the horizons to 50 years. And so from my understanding, MTA hasn't had like an official statewide transit plan before. So this is the first of its kind, and it gives us the chance to think and make some projections for a larger period of time and for the whole state. So I would say that's kind of the major distinction between the two, the time frame as well as who was involved and the scope of it. And I think Jade was mentioning as well, the RTP has kind of been moving through implementing the plan that was published again at the end of 2020. And so that is kind of informing how we're going to move forward into implementing the statewide transit plan with some of the implementation team and kind of the approaches to coordinate with the partners across Central Maryland, which will then be partners across the state.
Great. And as you know, Transit Choices does serve on the RTP implementation team. So we are always happy to communicate important information to our full coalition and then, provide input, comments, feedback, on both the statewide plan as well as the RTP. So thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor to additional questions. If you could raise your hand, if you'd like to ask a question of Jade or AJ. I did see some questions in the chat. Will, are you with us?
Hi, yeah. I did have a question on your slide where you mentioned measuring equity. One of the criteria was frequent transit service to certain communities. And I wanted to ask how frequent service was defined. Because is it, for example, like if you had multiple bus lines with a low frequency of service, but they were staggered so that at a given stop, there was like a bus every 15 minutes, would that count as high frequency of service? Like, I'd just like to see the specifics of how you define that. Yeah, thank you very much.
It's a great question. For local service, including what MTA operates, we define frequent as a route that has 15 minutes of service or better. So it really has to be a route, a single route, the same endpoints coming every 15 minutes. And then I think I mentioned for the regional and intercity service, frequent is more like 30 minutes or better.
When you're measuring that in a community then, so one of the criteria was served by frequent transit service. Would that mean served by a line that has frequent transit service? Or like, is there any kind of definition that includes the number of transit lines serving that area? Or yeah, just like how does that map on kind of to the geographical component of that?
As it's currently defined, it would be has a route that has frequent service.
Great, interesting, thank you.
Sure.
Klaus, do you have a question?
Yeah, AJ basically answered it already. There was no previous plan like this, so I modified the question. A good principle, a good start for a long-range plan is to analyze where the agency is currently not performing well and make that sort of the short-term goals to increase performance in those deficient areas. And I wonder whether that is in any way part of your effort.
Look like you're okay.
No, I don't know what, go ahead.
Sorry, Klaus, can you repeat the last part of the question?
So when you have these goals and objectives from equity to everything else, it seems to me it would make a good start to say in which of these areas are we performing particularly badly or particularly well, if you will, and then form the short-term 5-year goals with priority on those areas where underperformance is detected. And I wondered whether that effort to analyze this way what is integrated and baked into your approach.
Not sure I'm following the question. if we looked at existing conditions to
Yeah, right. So,
define
I mean,
metrics and the future metrics.
where against these current metrics that you establish in the plan, where your current service does not perform or particularly underperforms against those metrics. And seems like with these long range plans, it's really important to have priorities and set your efforts immediately into those places where the performance is the worst. And that's why I'm wondering whether this analysis that look back is part of the look forward.
Yeah, so part of what will be published with the final plan will be some additional technical reports that show that analysis a little bit more clearly. And that was reviewed a lot with the local operators during the roundtables that we held. So that was a big part of their input, and we talked about what to prioritize. The metrics also reflect, I think, right now what we're actually able to measure. And so a part of the conversation is there data or additional things that are hard to measure now that should be part of the early action plan, so we can start measuring that in the future.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Sure. Thanks, Robin. Really appreciate it. And thanks to you, Jade and AJ, for this wonderful presentation. I had a question in the chat. I'm going to ask that, and then I'm going to follow up on a question that Klaus asked as well, if that's okay. The question in the chat is just about, so I think it comes from the map slide where, like, I believe you mentioned you'd gathered some projections about growth in the region looking forward. And I can't remember whether those projections were economic or population or whatever they were, but the general question is, are those projections available somewhere publicly? That's the first question.
Okay, so to your first question, the projections are in a summarized kind of format in the actual draft plan.
Okay.
But they will also be part of those technical reports that I mentioned. And it is, you remembered correctly, it's jobs and housing, and there's also a little bit of travel pattern projections as well.
Okay, perfect. And that's only going to be available when the plan is finally published as sort of technical addendum to the plan?
Yes.
So is there any way to sort of get a look at those projections before the plan is published? Is that data public anywhere?
Well, they do come from existing regional travel models. So I think you could get an idea of the data that we used through some of the metropolitan planning organizations and the statewide planning department.
Okay, cool. And then just to follow up on the technical report side of it and what Klaus was asking for, about sort of the look back and to see where we're lacking in terms of equity and other metrics. Again, you mentioned that would be in the technical reports. It would be sort of the same question, like, is that available publicly anywhere now, or where's a good place to look might be a good question.
I think some of these are newer metrics. If you look, I think with the regional transit plan, we've started to put some of that out more. But the metrics that are in the draft are what's available publicly right now.
Okay, thanks.
The baseline metrics.
Thanks.
We also had a question from Lydia.
I'm afraid I'm not Lydia. I'm just Lydia's spokesman. I'm Charlie Duff on my wife's email account. Not trying to sneak
morning,
in
Charlie.
under a false passport here. And my question has to do with frequency. That Jade, you say that you're aiming for 15-minute headways, and that sounds like a laudable goal for commuter service or long haul service. But urban service is a very different animal. And in urban service, I was taught and have generally experienced that if you want people if you want to get choice riders, you need to have frequency of every 4 minutes at peak hours and every 8 minutes off peak. And I'm wondering if you're making provision for that.
So right now, our definition of frequent is 15-minute for local service, and it's not really separated by like rural, suburban, urban areas. But I'm hearing a comment then from both you and Will about, you know, rethinking those definitions or those metrics.
Yeah, because basically, what matters in long haul service, I think, is primarily fidelity to schedule. If you've got to catch the 7:03 or you get fired, then the 7:03 had better leave at 7:03. But in a city, what you really need is ease of transfers. So that if you want to go down and then across, you need a quick transfer. And the only way to do that is with frequency. Very different animal.
I see Will upvoting and hearting your comments. I appreciate those comments. I will definitely take that into consideration when we're looking at how we might make changes for the final plan.
And, you know,
Is it
Baltimore
frequencies
Link was a
defined?
good start on that in Baltimore City. No complaints there.
Yeah, I mean, it's incremental improvement. And to your point about the ease of transfers being a key part of that, that's definitely a strategy in the plan as well.
Yeah, because we're not there yet.
Thank you, Charlie. We actually have time for 3 more questions. Joseph?
Yes, thank you. Does the plan address the question of the level of investment, the funding that should be considered to implement these transit improvements?
This plan does not. We do those kinds of projections in our capital program on a 6-year basis. So I think you'd start to see more of the short-term action plans presented in that. It does cover, I think, more broadly how these would be funded, but doesn't apply specific dollar amounts. Those would come out of individual studies for each of the connections, and they may, for some of them, already exist in those studies.
Anna?
Hi, my question is about reliability, and I'm wondering if we are addressing that issue in this plan, because in my experience, at least, reliability is, while it's tied in with frequency, it seems like if you knew the bus was going to show up at 7:03, that's even if it wasn't all that frequent, it's better than going out there and not having any idea when the bus is going to show up. Or if the bus is going to show up.
Yeah, reliability is a big part of it. I think one of the strategies that AJ pulled out to highlight is focusing on third shift workers, where I think that's most critical because that's when the least amount of service. So if something's running every hour and one of those hourly buses doesn't show up, that's a huge deal in terms of maintaining employment. And we definitely understand that. And yeah, it's critical.
And our last question will come from Will.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask like 2 things. One was, again, just about that metric with the 15-minute, having a frequent service for 15 minutes. I wanted to ask if there, well, first of all, what was the process for developing and coming up with those metrics? And was there any attempt to look at like time from origin to destination in those underserved communities rather than frequency? Because a 15-minute bus that doesn't link you to vital destinations, of course, I wouldn't necessarily think that would be a win. And the other thing I wanted to ask is, you know, frequency is great, but there is also kind of the speed factor with rapid transit, and of course with a bus system where you're making more frequent stops, it's going to be slower, but also any system that isn't grade separated, especially in the downtown of Baltimore with a kind of compact grid, is going to run into, you know, it's not going to be as fast. So is there any attempt to look at mass transit projects that are grade separated and rapid and high capacity, rapid, grade separated mass transit projects that would be standard for a city like Baltimore. Thanks.
Okay, so the first comment was about how we came up with the metrics, including, I guess, focusing on frequency rather than a metric like travel time. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then also like rather than travel time, and also rather than like origin destination, like linking, like frequent. Yeah. So yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood. We got that question from one of our local operators as well. A big part of how we came up with the metrics was we were trying not to come up with metrics that would be a huge burden to measure across the state. So, we're a big operator and a big agency. We collect a lot of data, analyze a lot of data. Some of the local operators don't. So we're actually surprised to hear, they're asking the same questions and thinking of other metrics that they would want us to start measuring with them. Maybe we still need to work on developing additional metrics with our partners locally, and travel time was one of them. For the second question about, are we considering other grade separated or, dedicated modes? I think a good example of that is from the regional transit plan and the studies that we're already doing for the east-west and north-south corridors. I think we'll be coming out with more information on all of the alternatives, but they do include other modes than just, bus in traffic with other modes of transportation.
So when are those going to be coming out, the alternatives?
I want to say April or May, maybe.
Okay.
Others can correct me. We have other MTA staff who are working on those projects. And we're planning to reach out to Robin about outreach on those as well.
And I don't know if you can answer this, but what modes are being considered? Is it just bus rapid transit, or are you considering, rail transit?
Yeah, there are bus and rail options being considered.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Jade, and thank you, AJ, for your wonderful presentation. We look forward to receiving the presentation to share with our coalition participants. The next part of our agenda is an overview of transit choices activities. One of the things that we pride ourselves on is communicating the important work that we are doing in the public transit arena. But there is so much going on that we thought we'd take an opportunity to give you an overview. We put together a very brief PowerPoint that both Jimmy Rouse and I will sort of narrate through. And at the end, we will be happy to open the floor to questions. So at this juncture, I am going to bring up the PowerPoint. Okay. Jade, would you be able to bring up the PowerPoint for me, please?
Yes, happy to.
My stop sharing, my sharing button is not working properly.
Telling me that I can't share while you are sharing.
All right, let me stop share. Okay. Any better?
Yeah.
Perfect. So we'll just ask you to, navigate to the next slide, please. Excellent. We're in business. One of the things that Transit Choices spends a lot of time participating in is serving on various committees. As we have said many, many times, we believe in the power of partnership and collaboration, sort of speaking, with one voice to advance the public transit agenda. The first committee that we're participate on is sort of a reimagined Baltimore City Transit Advisory Committee. We were very instrumental in working with Baltimore City specifically Monica White, on reinstating ongoing meetings to talk about the Trump City Circulator, to talk about the Harbor Connector, and how we can improve those services. So we were very pleased and honored to be able to participate on that committee, which has been meeting monthly. And the purpose of that committee is to really talk about some potential service changes, if you will, to both the Trump City Circulator and the Harbor Connector, and ultimately how we can better integrate those two services. So in the spring of 2022, not too many months away, there will be a report that is issued talking about proposed changes. A big part of the committee's work is to sort of, as a mandate from Mayor Brandon Scott, to look at what the committee is doing through an equity lens. So as soon as that report is issued, we will make sure and share it with the Transit Coalition. But again, we are very pleased and honored to be a part of that effort on behalf of Baltimore City DOT. As I mentioned earlier, we serve on the Regional Transit Plan, or RTP, implementation team. This is a very, very important 25-year plan to sort of improve public transportation in Central Maryland. And it gives us the rare opportunity to present, comments, feedback, input on the plan to make sure what projects get prioritized. And, again, we will do the same with, respect to the statewide transit plan. Those RTP implementation meetings are held quarterly. The Transform MD Transportation Coalition is a great group of many, many organizations and individuals. It is diverse. Our goal is to really advocate for stronger, equitable, safe, and effective, public transit. We successfully lobbied for the passage of the Maryland Transit Safety and Investment Act. So that was a victory that we are all very proud of. And what we are identifying now are the next, or I should say, campaigns for the next 5 years. So it is our pleasure to serve on that committee. And a subset of that committee is the electrification work group. One of the key components of public transportation is to take a look at climate, right? How public transit affects climate. What can we do to be able to advance a cleaner, greener city, county, and eventually the world. But a small piece of that is to take a look at how we can advocate for the electrification of our vehicles. And what I mean by that are passenger cars, transit and school buses, and trucks. So there are a lot of campaigns and conversations out there of how we can reduce climate pollution that is high on the priority list of transit choices. And we will keep you apprised, as we always do, of our progress moving forward. Next slide, please.
So Robin, you want me to take this?
Yes, please.
So one of the things I think Transit Choices has been doing for some time now, which is a real value to the community, is to have these monthly meetings. And part of what makes these valuable is your all's participation. So thank you for those who are on this Zoom meeting. And we've been getting good participation since we went to a Zoom format, even better than we did when we had in-person meetings. The goal of the meetings is twofold. One, to give key leadership in the public transit arena an opportunity to speak on the issues and projects that they're working on. And they really appreciate this opportunity, as you can see when I talk about who's been the last 5 meetings we've had. But just as importantly as having leadership speak on their projects and issues, as we've seen from this presentation this morning, it also gives you, the public, an opportunity to interact directly with these leaders and to bring questions and suggestions to them. No other organization is doing this, to create this communication between leadership and public. And we think it's a very important thing. I would just want to run through the most recent presentations that we've had. Greg Slater, who was at the time MDOT secretary, presented a very interesting discussion of how he would use the additional federal funding that's coming into Maryland for transportation, how he would prioritize it on specific projects. I love the fact that he said that he felt it was most important to direct funds to the people who were most dependent on transit, those without access to a car. So we share that value with him, and we're sorry to lose him. He went to another opportunity. We're glad for him, and we hope that Jim Ports, I'll talk about in a minute, his replacement, will continue the work that Greg started. We also had Steve Sharkey from CityDOT present about his vision for what he wants to happen with, what he wants to do with CityDOT in the next year and beyond. All these presentations are available on our website with the PowerPoints that they presented and the recording. So if anybody wants to go back and listen or see what was said, you're welcome to do that on our website. Holly Arnold presented, the head of MTA, on opportunities and initiatives in the year ahead. We had Steve Sharkey, Holly, Don Halligan from Baltimore Metropolitan Council did a fascinating presentation on a 6-month study that they had done about the regional transit governance and funding. And what this is preparing for, a lot of people are calling for a regional transit authority. Well, Don's group looked at what was happening nationwide in terms of regional transit authorities and how we could go from where we are now with the MTA to a regional transit authority. And he came up with 6 options. One, the first be to do nothing, and the last be to have a regional transit plan. And there are various steps in between. So this will be a valuable study to direct what happens next in terms of bringing in a regional transit authority to our area, which a lot of people are calling for. Finally, we also had a discussion on the Red Line, the future of the Red Line. Sam Jordan from Transit Equity, Wes Guckert, President and CEO of the Traffic Group, and Al Barry of AB Associates presented 3 different visions of what should happen next with the Red Line. So we feel that these sessions that we have, these Zoom sessions, provide a real value for the community, and it's one of the things that Transit Choices is proud of that we're doing. So upcoming meetings, we plan to meet with Steve Sharkey, and we have questions for Steve as a follow-up to his presentation. And we welcome your all's input into what other questions we should be asking when we meet with him. We know the mayor has an equity as a priority in any discussion about transit. And it is our belief that equity is wrapped up in, can best be achieved by land use planning. In other words, like we have the Raise project that was presented by Bhadai when he came to Baltimore, funds for the Raise project, which is to build an east-west connector, as I'm sure you're aware. But to make that really effective, we think there needs to be land use planning along with the implementation of dedicated bus lanes, transit signal prioritization. And so we're curious to ask Steve what his vision of land use is as part of the transportation planning process. We also wanted to ask him about what's being done at CityDOT to reduce carbon emissions. We feel strongly that global warming is a real challenge to all of us. And we need to be pressing at every point to try to do what we can to reduce carbon emissions. And so we're pressing him or asking him how global climate change figures into their planning as part of CityDOT. And also we wanted to find out what CityDOT's attitude towards a regional transit authority is, and what part they plan to play in that discussion. So we have this meeting, which I don't think it's been scheduled yet, but is upcoming, and we welcome your all's input into any other questions we should be asking. We also plan to meet with James Port, who's Greg Slater's replacement. We want to find out if he shares Greg's values and will follow his plan for the distribution of federal funds. And we will get James to speak at a future Transit Choices meeting. We're fortunate we know James because early on when we were working on the Baltimore Link project and we're having meetings with the MTA on it, he became a regular attendee for those meetings. And so we got to know him and we've already had communication with him and he looks forward to speaking to the group. Lastly, we're going to meet with Holly Arnold, and I'm going to come back to that later, talking about the campaign that we're envisioning, all the buses all the time. So Robin, do you want to go on the next part?
Yes. We wanted to share a little bit about our advocacy and support. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but I will be happy to share all this information when I send out, the meeting summary. With respect to our advocacy, specifically in support, most recently we provided both oral and written testimony for MTA Senate Bill 208. The purpose of this bill was to increase the penalties for intentionally causing physical injury to certain individuals providing public transit services. The level of harassment and the level of physical injuries has shockingly increased, particularly since the pandemic. There's a lot of, anger, people are frustrated. We find any physical injury or the mistreatment of transit service operators unacceptable. So we did provide both, oral and written testimony to that effect. We also provided support on the 2021 Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, which Jimmy just mentioned a moment ago, the RAISE grant program. This has to do with the proposed east-west priority corridor project to cohesively improve transportation and economic opportunities for the Baltimore region. Accessibility improvements. This has to do with proposed improvements to pave the way for improving safety, multimodal connectivity, and access to economic opportunities for residents in Southwest Baltimore, a community that definitely continues to experience long-term economic distress and a history of underinvestment in mobility infrastructure. And then accelerating zero emissions toward a cleaner future. Jimmy and I have alluded to this before. The purpose of this project is to expand MDOT MTA zero emission bus fleet, very, very important, and obviously the accompanying charging infrastructure. Next slide.
So this is me, right?
Yes.
So this is an idea in formation. As Anna referred to, the big issue with taking the bus is whether the bus is going to show up at all. Right now, MTA is 80 drivers short of what they need to run all the buses all the time. So on any given day, buses are yanked from their route simply because they do not have the drivers to man them all. So we have an opportunity here with all this federal money coming into the city for transit. I think it is very important that we focus on making sure that every bus runs as scheduled. And we are talking to Holly. We're going to meet with her to ask how Transit Choices can play a role in a campaign both to recruit the 80 drivers they need, to work on issues like absenteeism and mechanical failure, with the goal of making sure that every day when a bus is scheduled, it runs. And my idea here is to bring this more into public focus, to make this more of a public campaign where we're talking about what the performance is, has been, are we making progress? Are we training more drivers? What can be done more? Can we use additional funds to achieve this goal? I mean, we can talk about transit signal prioritization, dedicated bus lanes, but it amounts to nothing if your bus doesn't show up. And, I was first presented with this issue when I ran Louis Bookstore Cafe, and I had employees who just could not count on buses showing up to make it to work on time. And I had to let them go because they couldn't come to work in a consistent manner. This is very important for people that are transit dependent to have all the buses running. So we're going to work on this. I'm welcome any of yours input on thoughts about this idea. And as I said, it's an idea in formation, but it's definitely one of the things that we want to work on at Transit Choices.
Thank you, Jimmy. Jade, may we minimize the presentation, please? Before we conclude and obviously open the floor for questions, I know we are actually at 9:30. I also wanted to share some exciting news, which is that Transit Choices, in partnership with the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance in Bikemore, will be hosting a 2022 gubernatorial forum at the Real News Network in Baltimore City. The focus of the forum will be specific to how these potential leaders plan to prioritize public transit and infrastructure in Baltimore City and also the region. As many of you may recall, Transit Choices hosted a very successful gubernatorial forum in 2018. We plan to replicate that with some changes. So as our planning progresses, we will definitely keep you apprised of our progress. Are there any questions or comments? before we conclude for today? Well, we thank you all for joining us. As we've said many times, we are successful because of your, engaged participation and ongoing interest. So for that, we sincerely thank you. We have another exciting meeting planned in either February or March with Chris Ryer, who's, in the Transportation Planning Department, to talk about some very important initiatives that he and colleagues are working on. So without further ado, we wish you a wonderful day and thank you again.